Well, welcome to everyone today to another BYU Library Family History Center presentation. As mentioned, these are recorded and put up on the BYU Library Family History Center website, as well as the BYU Library Family History Center YouTube channel. So they're available usually within a week after the presentation. We're going to talk today about using the FamilySearch full text search feature, which was introduced at RootsTech back in March. And as far as I'm concerned, it's basically going to revolutionize everything we have to do with computers. And the reason that it may not be as good as some people is, and some people feel like they're really contributing when they're doing indexing, but unfortunately, the technology, if used more completely, will kind of obviate the need to have any human indexing involved. And here we'll get into how that occurs and why that occurs. First of all, where is it? And it's still in the familysearch.org/labs website. And that's where they put their new programs, and it changes not constantly, but pretty close to continuously. In other words, there's always going to be some new changes. And so you might want to look at that from time to time to see what's coming down the road to FamilySearch and what they'll be putting online. Now, with regards to full text, I'm going to get into the explanation more in detail, but this is something that they have announced when they announced the program, that they would be extending full text searches to as many of the records on FamilySearch as possible to do so. And so we're going to have a lot of these records available in the future. Right now, there's millions and millions and millions of them, but they're in very specific categories. So here's what it looks like when you finally click through to look at it. And down at the bottom there, the screen is a keyword search, which means you can put in virtually any word that you want to look for. And that's exactly what a full text search is. It means every word. Normally, of course, they're not going to worry about the ands and the does and all of the other connector words, but the substantial words are all searchable. I mean, you could search for the, but nobody would really need that. On the other hand, you can search for names, you can search for places, you can search for anything you can imagine, an occupation, you could search for an address, you could search for anything you could think of that you want to search for that could appear in a document in one of the categories that is being searched, then that will come out. And that's what it's called, why it's called a full text search. So it's currently available as of yesterday and today for U.S. land and probate records. Now, when you say that, they're saying at a huge number of land and probate records from all over the United States. And so there's really amazing amount of information that's been incorporated here. The other one is called Mexico notary records, and in Mexico, the notaries are people who have to affix their seal to every legal document. So anything you do, get born, died, buy a house, enter a business, to whatever it is, requires notary involvement. And unfortunately, these records, for many years, they've been there online for a long time, but they're practically impenetrable because they're just narratives. The notary just says, I just had this document and I did this and I notarized it, and so it's done. But the information in those documents, you would have to search page by page and read all the way through the document in order to get any kind of information out of the notary records. But now with full page search, you can search for the names of the people, you can search for the places, you can search for anything that would be helpful and find it. And that will take you right to it. Same thing with Australia land and probate records and New Zealand land and probate records. The last category is U.S. plantation records. Now, the U.S. plantation records are a huge number of records. It's everything to do with the plantations in any part of the country that they existed, that they've been categorized as that. And what happened, even before this was released to the general public, was that there is a project going on sponsored in part by FamilySearch and American Ancestors and a number of other organizations. It's called the 10 Million Name Project, and the 10 million names refers to the number of enslaved people who were brought to America from the very earliest dates in the 1600s to the end of slavery per se in the 1860s. So basically, what has enabled us to do is to search these probate records, because the people who were enslaved were property, and they show up in probate records. And obviously, plantation records for the same reason. They were people who worked the plantations. And so it became a tremendous tool for opening up research in areas that cannot necessarily be searched by trying to find names, because you don't know the names, you don't know the places, you don't know anything. And so you can start searching and finding information that you didn't imagine even existed. So this is the kind of thing that do it. And the concept here is that new sets of these records will be added regularly. And since they brought it out, there's actually plantation records came on after RootsTech. When you start to understand how many millions and millions of records there are in these groups of records that they're putting into the full text search, that you'll understand why it's going to take some time for them to do this. So in order to understand a little bit more specifically how this works, you need to understand there's a difference between an index and a full text search. And first of all, an index involves a selection of specific information that's going to go into the index. So when you're doing an index on anything, so the first step is that you have to say, well, what are we going to index? And the most common things for genealogy is names, places, and dates. Sometimes some of the other information is enclosed. And as you learn very quickly as you do genealogical research, and you find that you're working with an index, you wish you could see the original record, because you always know that the original record would have additional information not contained in the index. And so indexes are basically ignore the rest of the information that's in that particular record, whatever it is. So probably the most obvious example of what happens with an index is the genealogy books that are either ancestral, go back, tracing an ancestry back, or showing the descendants, the descendancy books where they're descendants of a person, maybe a famous person, maybe someone who first came to the country, of whatever. But it's very common for those books to have a list of every person who's mentioned in the book and the page number where they're mentioned. And they're very helpful, because then you can go directly to the person without having to read the entire book and figure it out for yourself. But it's obvious that all of the text in the book is being ignored. So whatever else is in the book and is not a name doesn't show up in the index. So if you're looking for somebody, occupation, or you're looking for somebody who lived in a certain place, the book isn't that helpful. The index of the book isn't that helpful. Now, if the book has been copied, digitized, and it's print book, then we've had the technology to use that to create full text searches of books for many years. It's been around for quite a long time. And so even though this is a very useful type of index, it's very limited. And it's not sometimes obvious when you're dealing with the larger genealogical websites when you get the information that you obtain, and it's coming from an index rather than from a total amount of information from the original record. There are differences between the various online websites. FamilySearch had started using full text searches with the books that they've digitized in their books section. If you go to search books and you find a book that is available, it isn't under copyright or something like that, you can search word for word for that whole book because it's something that's been available for a long time. It's also available in other places. So here's what would happen if I'm searching in the historical records. That's when you're looking at the search area of FamilySearch.org. You're looking at where it says search historical, it says search historical records or records. And so if I put a name into, I have to assume, okay, this is important before I get into entering a name. I have to assume that the name has been indexed and that it's been accurately transcribed. So even though it may be an index of a certain amount of records or a book or anything else, it may not be, it may have been skipped or it may not have been transcribed properly. So, and if it's only one name in a whole book or one name in a set of documents that's been indexed, you may have lost the one name that was actually there. Technically, from the standpoint of having basic genealogical information, we don't consider indexes to be primary source documents. Primary source documents are documents that were created at or near the time of an event by someone who either participated in the event or had a duty to record the event. Birth certificate, for example, in the United States during some of the years when birth certificates became available. That can be indexed by the names, and then you can find the name through the name and the place and the year using using the name of the person, the place the events occurred, and the date or approximate date occurred. You can often find a document. The problem, of course, is that in some cases, we don't have the original documents. All we have is an index. And what do you do with the index? Well, you can use the information, but you always need to be aware that you're not getting the entire amount of information from the record itself. And the transcription or the index may be incorrect. Okay, so let's suppose I add some information into the record. And this is a search, and I'm doing this search for a last name. I'm going back to one of my ancestors that lived back in this 17th and 18th centuries in Rhode Island. And so if I'm going to search, it's going to search and find every William Tanner that is in these records. And by doing the search, I end up with 328 William Tanners. Now I can even, because the way this is set up with FamilySearch and in most of the others, this is the same kind of thing you're going to receive in the other websites. They're both transitioning. Let's say Ancestry, MyHeritage, and some of the other websites are transitioning to using AI more and more intensely. But right now, what's happening is that there's still indexes out there, and it's going to be those partially indexed records. Now, looking at this, if you go through this, you'll see that there's a lot of William Tanners mentioned, and the number up there, 328, says that there are 328 records for William Tanner. And most of these don't have enough information for us to even see what it could be. And it requires us to click on the document, on the name, look at the record, and then we have to determine if we just looked at an index or if we're now have a original document to look at. And then we can maybe go back to the original document, and sometimes you'll find out that this doesn't really is my person, or maybe it is my person. But there's nothing real here that you can tell whether or not this person is your person. Now, in Rhode Island at that time, I've done a lot of research in Rhode Island about this is my Tanner line, and this is William Tanner's the last one in that line that we've been able to get to identify. We really don't know who he was because we haven't found enough information about him to differentiate him from at least 6 or 8, maybe as high as 10 different William Tanners who lived at the same time in Rhode Island. So it's not as, sometimes it's not as clear as it might be using an index to look to search for an individual. So let's see what happens if I do a full text search. Now, in this case, I'm doing a jump in technology. I'm going from the index that has been created by someone who sat down and figured out which fields they wanted to look at, and then people who went through the process, whether it was the original person or volunteers, like might happen with FamilySearch, were people who looked at the records and typed in the names into the index, and then the index was published as a document or added to an existing index as more documents were indexed. And we all understand, or should understand, I would say, the importance of having an index. But here what we're doing is we're jumping over and out of the index realm into full text, meaning every word in every document searched all the way through the whole record and every record. So now we're going to look and see what happens if we're going to do a full text search. And there's some more options here. And there's a disclaimer, and it says that this is an experimental labs product and it's not guaranteed to be always available. Well, maybe. And then it also tells you that you're looking at those records that I mentioned, the record sets that I've mentioned previously. So this is all going to be evolving. Now, what the commitment on FamilySearch is, what they were saying is that they were going to try to do this with all the records, but it's interesting because some of the records are restricted in certain different ways. So it may there may going to be some changes, but it's going to have to evolve in a way that reflects the realities of which documents are actually available. So now we're going to start, and this one I'm going to start with just William Tanner. I don't need to put in some other information, but I'm going to have to make some what you might call applying filters. Now, a filter is something that says, I don't want to see this. In other words, you're telling the program that you want to, not that you want to see specific information, but that you don't want to see specific information. How does that make sense? Maybe. But let's see how it works. In this case, I will want to specify a collection. So that's the first thing I can do. Then a year, and then a place, and finally record type. If I do that, I will have focused in on a very, very specific set of records. And you see right now, there's 9,100 William Tanners out there in all the records. So now I'm going to add these filters in, and I'm going to put in, as you work with this, you may start out with the year, or you may start out with a place. I would always start out with the record collection, because you need to have the geographic area delimited long before you have the ability to look. I mean, the other things do not matter if you're looking all over the country, because they won't be focusing. So they actually are organized from left to right. They're from collection, year, place, in the order that it would be most logical to use these. So now I filtered it by collection, Rhode Island wills and deeds, 1700s to 2017. And I click apply that filter. And the next thing that happens is it tells me how many dates, how many names come up in different dates. So if I click year. And so you can see through the 1700s, from 1720 on through, that there's records that match back to William Tanner. So then when I've done the filter, I have a total of 22 records to look at. From my standpoint, a 22 records is like nothing at all, meaning I will go through that page by page rather than I'm out. I've worked my way out of worrying about another filter because I want to make sure my searches are as broad as possible, but at the same time as focused as possible. So they're competing interests, but once you get down to this kind of a point, and this says there are like, a couple of dozen documents out there, I will look at all of them because I know that there's going to be variations and things. Now, over on the right-hand side, you'll see some additional types of things you can use. Some of these look vaguely like what's called Boolean algebra. Includes this, does not include this, kinds of symbols. They are sometimes helpful and they're sometimes usable, but generally speaking, if you use the filters down fairly rapidly, then if there's still too many documents, then you may need to focus it a little bit more. But I would do the filtering before you get into putting plus and minuses and asterisks on everything. So now we have a set of documents here. So now I begin to look at those documents, and I find rather quickly a indenture, which is a sale of a piece of property for William Tanner. And the interesting part is that this is an entirely new document, and it shows that his wife, and it mentions his son Francis, who is my direct line ancestor, and it's in the exact same place where we would expect it to be. But this is an entirely new document. In other words, I have never seen this before, and I doubt that anyone in all the years that they've been doing research has combed through every one of the documents that are totally only if they're in order by date. But you would have to look clear through and read through every line of every document, and it would take a tremendous amount of time, which I've done, by the way, and spent all day long reading town records in New England and such. And I'm very well of the process, very aware of the process. But this isn't a document that anybody seems to have ever turned up. It's not that it wasn't there, but it wasn't possible to find it without and you wouldn't know where to start and where to look. Because what's happened here is they've gathered all the land and probate records together in one big pile, and you're searching the whole pile. So you don't even have to worry about it. Once you've filtered it down some, then you've actually just made smaller piles, and we got it down to a smaller pile that was small enough that we would be also able. And it helps to go read before and after the document, because now you have something that maybe has some context that would be historical context that you would be able to use. I can't express, it's hard for me to express in any rational terms, the importance of being able to find documents like this. Now, if we go back in the history of FamilySearch and genealogists such as myself, you might want to know that we've been asking them, why haven't they done a full document search before? Why are we now in 2024 having something that we've been wanting since whenever? And that is, there's a simple answer to that. So here's another example. Before we get into some of the reasons why this could have had been earlier or not had or whatever, let's just say that we are in the situation where you can start looking. So I'm going to do it again with a different name and in a completely different place and a different time period and everything else, so that you can see what you can do with this. So I'm putting in great-grandfather Henry Christian Overson, and that's it. That's what I put in. Okay. And then I can start to filter. So I filtered this down, and there's the filtered results. You got 33,510. But in this case, since they are in sort of an alphabetical order, the actual county and time period that I was looking for came up first. So I wasn't forced to go down and put in all that filter information or even add in more information. What I wanted was right there at the beginning. And this Overson list of records are all my relatives. And again, these are records in deeds that it's possible to conceive of someone who would sit down and go through the entire Apache County, Arizona deed records from 1890s to the present, 1880s, and look at every single deed just to find a mention of one individual, but it's just not likely to happen. And yes, there's probably a deed index at the county level for this, but what this has created is a way of doing this without the overhead of having to deal with the county grantor-grantee index and things like that. So what we're looking at here is Henry C. Overson in 1914, 1916, down the way. And yes, that's documents right here. Now, this is another part because this is a step up from the document we saw before. And the reason being that this is a printed document, and therefore it was relatively easy to get an optical character recognition example of all the names and all the words in the document. So now on the right-hand side, we have a transcription, and this is what the original document looked like. And when we start looking at it, this is basically a document that is back and forth between people who are all my relatives. Every one of these people mentioned in here is a relative. And so this is important stuff. This adds just a whole new aspect to the concept of being able to look at these documents. And the reason why it's important is because it's on FamilySearch, and I have my family tree there, and information, and I have other places I can look now that I know that this set of documents exists. And there may be things about this that help us to understand and do it. But the very basic thing it does is identify property that was owned or is maybe still owned by members of the family. What it was is the information is there. It's very difficult to find. It's not going to be information that you would even imagine was available. In other words, in all the years that I've been doing the research, I knew that the land and property records, and I could look in land and property records. But the problem, what has happened in that case was that I have made a decision that, I've got enough information about that person. I really don't need to find any more information. Although finding this more information about the land sales and the property sales may be pivotal in finding people that aren't so well known in the record, and also confirming and making all of the relationships known. And so these are the kinds of records that let's say are, for the most part, completely ignored by genealogists because of all the things I've said about them being difficult. And the fact that you often don't even imagine that those disks, that information is available. So kind of to reemphasize this, a full text search is exactly that. It searches all the words in the document. And what made that possible and why was it not possible before, when we realized, is because it was restricted to printed documents, meaning documents that had type that you could, like a newspaper type or book type, that you could read. And what was the key to that? The key to that was the basis of the technology, and I'll mention that. But first, let me mention this, that there's a video that's available on YouTube from FamilySearch that tells you in a few short minutes sort of an introduction to how this works. It doesn't go into all the commentary that I'm giving, but it does give you sort of a fast look. So now let's go back and look at the history. This will help you to understand why FamilySearch and other places didn't have this jump in this as much as they could have. Because it emerged in the 1960s, the actual computer involvement with the full text searching was in the 1960s, and it was notably from IBM in a system called Stairs that was introduced in 1969. And they started doing this with online bibliographic databases, for example, listing all of the books in a library and call numbers and all that kind of thing in the 1990s. And then they just kept developing and developing. And there's lots of places you can look and find full text search capabilities today. It's all over the place. One of the biggest one is the largest online completely searchable library in the world, and that's the Internet Archive. And it has now over 41 million records, books and records. That's the little yellow icon down there in the bottom that says 41M. And all of those books are completely searchable word for word and are free to search. Now, some of them are under copyright, and there's restrictions about the time you can look at them. In other words, you check the book out for like 2 weeks, or you might be able to only check it out for an hour. But in that hour, you can do the search because the capability is there to search word for word all the way through that document. And that's over 40 million books and documents. Here's the crux. This is really what I didn't want to get into this too early in the discussion because it just kind of makes it a little more complicated to think about. But the full text searches of a large number of documents, like the huge collections of documents that FamilySearch put together with the land and probate records and the foundation records and the notary records, all of that, it takes a great deal of computer memory. I mean, first of all, you're loading in lots of information. And secondly, it takes a measurable time for a search to be made. When you're doing a search of a whole book for one name, that may, if the book has been completely full text indexed, meaning that they've created a pattern of it in the computer, then it can pick that name up out of the book rather quickly. But the first processing of the documents takes a tremendous amount of information, computer memory and processing power. So as computers become more and more sophisticated, larger in a sense, faster in a sense, and more memory and all that, it was only until just say recently that came within the realm of what somebody like FamilySearch could afford to do. In other words, you need to have that amount of computer access to that kind of computer power, plus the people who could do all this stuff, plus all of that. And that technology is only now coming out. So the cost of the memory and processing power are becoming less expensive. If you really want to know, I just bought a 16 terabyte hard drive, and that would cost me about $350. So memory is no longer an issue of absolute expense, except when you get in these huge databases where there may be more information, and it just basically starts to slow down the system. So then the systems have to get faster to be able to handle the larger amounts of information. Let's just say we're in the position today where these things have become possible. So what was the basis, though, from the standpoint of FamilySearch, that was the sticking point? Why were we sitting around on our hands essentially for so many years? Well, we weren't. The answer is it's called handwriting. And the issue here is having that we need that's why people were doing the indexing for so long, because the handwriting recognition was not something that was feasible, as well as available in the sense of not costing more than anything else that you wanted to do. So the question was, when would this become available? It's been a handwriting recognition started back, the development started back in the 1960s also, but it came out when they finally developed the processing and the ability to read the text and use the text and the script. That came out only about 2 or 3 years ago, where it became possible for that to happen. And the demonstration of it that was the most important one for the genealogical community was the complete recognition of the 1950 census in about 6 hours. And then it was about a couple of more months of going back and refining it, the index. But that was something that came about very, very quickly. So handwriting recognition is now a given thing. It's being used by FamilySearch constantly to do the targeting records right now in Latin America and in some in English language countries. And that was the process. That was what needed to occur for full text to make any sense at all in putting forth this great effort. If only documents that you could process had to be printed documents, in other words, having text printed it like on a book. That was one of the main reasons why we couldn't do anything, because the number of documents that are just full of just text are like books. Well, they were done. Books have been available fully searchable for quite a while. But it was not until we had handwriting recognition that we could actually get into it and do anything. So the searches have powerful capabilities. They're able to get in and search, but it's essential to their use and implementation that there's resource trade-offs. So modern search aids aim to strike a balance between accuracy, speed, and memory usage. And all three of those, accuracy, of course, is totally important. But when you get into speed and memory usage, those are things that you have to be able to purchase and use without losing everything. In other words, you have to have a computer that can do the work and run the programs, and there has to be a way to access the information. Well, it's only been a few years since FamilySearch digitized all their records. And now that all the records are digitized, that's one more step. So you can go see that when they're talking about the balances, they have to, all of these different parts of the process had to be complete before they could start into processing handwriting with it, using handwriting recognition, a considerable pile of documents. One of the things that we have is knowledge that this has only happened in the last couple of years. It's been about 2 or 3 years when handwriting recognition finally got to be the point that it was better than any expert human. Now we go back to the original issue that I talked about, and that was why we're talking about artificial intelligence. And all of these programs that we're dealing with here fall under the category of our AI programs. So as you understand that, then you'll realize that it's been years and years and years developing these sophisticated programs before they reached the level that they all of a sudden appeared and made news. But that doesn't mean that they weren't there before, or that weren't being developed or understood or whatever. So, for instance, one of the AI things that's coming out is being able to talk back and forth to the computer. Well, voice recognition. I saw voice recognition back in the 1960s at the Seattle World Fair. That's when they started voice recognition with IBM. And so these are technologies that have been around for a very long time in some cases, but have now gotten to the point of being usable because of what I just mentioned. the speed and capabilities and memory of the computers that are involved. So if you're wondering why it wasn't here yesterday or last week or 10 years ago, it's because of all those factors. And in addition to that, all of these technologies had to come together and be utilized by people who were seriously wanting to do a specific project, and that is to digitize old records and extract the genealogically valuable information. And that had to come together at the same time and be in the realm of something that was, let's say, cost effective, worth the effort, worth more than the having volunteers do it on a volunteer basis. So that's where it started to come through. Now, the problem with talking about anything that has to do with either full text searching or AI, it very quickly becomes mired in tech speak, where you're talking about programming languages and all the different kinds of textual things. And what I like to make sure everyone understands is that we don't want to get bogged down in the technical language. When we have these functions, these things that show up on your smartphone or show up in these programs, the idea there is to experiment and find out what the full capability of it is. In my case, the two examples that I gave of being able to find deeds that I had no idea I wouldn't even thought to look for them previously. But by just doing a search, I find information like it's been given to me that I didn't even have any idea. So that's very valuable to us. But when you're working with all of this information, there's so much extraneous stuff out there that doesn't have anything to do with working with historical records and extracting names and historical records and genealogy. That really it isn't something that we can, you just need to be aware that not everything that's coming out, not everything they're talking about AI is going to help you. I mean, one quick example is all of these images that I've put in here. A lot of them you probably could recognize were AI generated images. Well, none of those are particularly pertinent to doing genealogical research. They're helpful to me as I teach and use images because a very important thing is that they're not copyright protected. They're instantly in the public domain because they're created by a machine. And so from at least now, as the law is put together, they're usable and they speed up my process of doing all of my presentations. But that doesn't mean that doing generating images has any very specific way of being used for genealogical research. So that's the reason why these things are so narrow and not talked about. You're not really ever going to see much of the news in the general news streams that you come across on the internet in your what's new type things, talking about someone who was able to find a deed that was done back in the 1700s. And that's just not something that anybody's going to be interested in if you don't have an interest in genealogy. So when you're doing this, what I would suggest is use the common way. Now, this is not generally accepted. In other words, there's different opinions out there in the genealogical community about how you do searches. But from the standpoint of optimal searching, and that is to spend the least amount of time with the highest amount of useful results. All I can say is after sitting on computers for the last 30 plus years and doing searches, that I know that it's always best to start out with as few terms as possible and add on terms for more specific results. So you start out with the name and then you filter it. Or you start out with a name and then you add dates and places and things like that. Because if you start out with too much information, then you never know what to take off to find the information. And that just makes it very difficult to get accurate information when you're searching. Another thing that's important is to use the results of your searches to suggest additional search terms. So as you look at the documents, you may find names in there, you may find other information that is part of what you're looking for in your family. And so use the documents to create additional search terms. That's another factor that's very important. And also to recognize that searching, computer searches, and I'm focusing more on that, is an acquired skill. So you need to keep practicing. It means you need to spend your time. There are days when I go back and just for interest's sake, I say, well, how many searches have I done? And like, say, the first 2 hours, I sat down at my computer and I can be in the 60s to 100 or more searches in a matter of just an hour or two. And that's just because it's just the basic process of doing research and finding information. And the more you do it, the faster and more efficient you'll be. And that's something that takes practice. Okay, well, thanks for watching.
James, we have a comment or question in the Q&A, and then there's also a couple of questions in the chat. And one of them, I think this was at the beginning of your presentation, about would this include Hawaiian plantations?
I'm not sure what they have in that collection. It's not very specific. It's just a huge number of records. The simplest way to find out is look for something in Hawaii. I mean, the fastest way to work with this kind of technology is to use the technology to answer your questions. So if I were doing it, I would just sit down and put Hawaii as a keyword and see if anything comes up in that plantations. But it would be right now, all of it, when you do a search, you're technically searching all of those, unless you designate which collection you want to look at.
Will users ever be able to correct or update the full transcript section of a document?
Yes, that will be possible, and it will probably be one of the things that they will do. There are ways to do that, but right now it's not something they have on FamilySearch up front.
Sandra Burbank asked, do you need the exact collection name for a search?
No. Basically, if you just put collection there, then it will give you some options for searching for which collection you want to use. It'll tell you what's available.
And Ralph Willett asks, when using full search text and I have the document open, I'm having a hard time finding the exact probate book, etc. They are showing a broad title of where the original record is. Am I doing something wrong?
No, that's always been a problem. That's an issue whenever you obtain a copy of a document. It may have to find the document. The document you're going to find is going to be in the context of where it's located, and it'll give you a general place. But to go back and find the original documents, I think that's going to be the same process that we've had to do before, and it takes it's hard to do. Let's just say it.
Okay, another question. Can you repeat which countries there are these kinds where there are these kinds of records? Is there a timeline for what countries will have available records?
Well, FamilySearch is saying that all of their records will eventually be processed. That's like saying all of their microfilm will be processed, and that we expected that to take 30 years, and it didn't. And I would guess the same thing here is they're probably looking like 20 or 30 years down the road, but the technology will change so rapidly that by the time they get into it, they'll probably be able to handle all of that in a relatively shorter time period. Right now, the only countries that are involved are the ones that are listed: Australia, New Zealand, and Mexico and the United States.